For 6 months, I let my son and daughter-in-law live in my home rent-free while they built theirs. Then one morning, she looked at me and decided she could choose who stayed in my house and who had to leave. My son thought I would give in like always. This time, they had pushed the wrong woman too far. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my coastal Maine home, casting long shadows across the granite island. I was setting down my mug of black coffee when my daughter-in-law Heather walked into the kitchen wearing her tailored trench coat. She did not greet me, nor did she look at the ocean view I had spent 30 years working as a high school librarian to afford. Instead, she adjusted her watch and gestured vaguely toward the guest wing I had spent months converting into a cozy sanctuary for my retirement. My parents' flight lands next Friday. Heather said, her tone sharp and devoid of any warmth. They will stay here. You won't. I stood still, the warm ceramic of my mug pressing against my palm. My son Julian sat at the dining table, staring intently at his laptop screen, pretending that the hum of his morning emails was the only sound in the room. He knew his wife's family was coming for a 2-month summer visit, but he had assured me last week that we would easily manage the space together. "Excuse me," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Heather smiled, a brief, practiced curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "My parents need the main level suite, Helen. They have joint issues. You can spend the summer at that seasonal RV park near the bay. It's practically a vacation." Julian's fingers paused over his keyboard, but he did not lift his head. He had always avoided confrontation, relying on me to smooth things over whenever Heather made unreasonable demands. But this was not about sharing household chores or deciding where to order Sunday dinner. This was an outright eviction from my own home. "My parents will stay here. You won't." My daughter-in-law smiled. I said nothing, I just called the locksmith. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a frantic defense of my property rights. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee, walked past Heather without a word, and grabbed my jacket from the entryway hook. The quiet click of the front door closing behind me was the only sound in the house. I walked down the gravel driveway toward my small garden shed, a habit I had formed over decades whenever I needed to analyze a complex problem without emotional interference. This was not an isolated incident of thoughtlessness. Over the past 6 months since Julian and Heather moved into my home to save money while building their new house, a steady pattern had emerged. It began with minor encroachments, such as Heather rearranging my kitchen cabinets to suit her organic meal preparations, and then progressed to larger dismissals of my routine. She had slowly claimed the formal living room as her remote working office, suggesting I keep my reading to the small porch out back. Julian had rationalized every boundary line Heather crossed. "She's just stressed with work, Mom," he would whisper whenever I brought up the growing tension. "It's temporary. Just let it go for now." His passivity had allowed Heather's sense of entitlement to expand until she genuinely believed she could dictate who occupied my property. Sitting on my workbench among the potting soil and brass garden shears, I realized that arguing with Heather would accomplish nothing. She viewed my politeness as frailty and my quiet nature as submission. She believed that because I loved my son, I would endure any humiliation to keep the peace. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my contact list. I did not call Julian, nor did I attempt to mediate the situation through family channels. I dialed a local number I had used years ago when the hardware store installed new deadbolts on the property. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to Arthur, a local craftsman who had managed the security hardware for half the homes along our stretch of the shoreline. "Arthur's Lock and Key," he said in his familiar Down East cadence. "Hello, Arthur. It's Helen Vance," I said, keeping my tone crisp and professional. "I need a complete lock replacement for my primary residence. All exterior doors, including the side entry and garage access. I would like high-security electronic keypads installed with access restricted strictly to my personal master code." Arthur paused briefly on the line. "Everything all right out there, Helen? I thought Julian was staying with you." "Everything is fine. I replied calmly. I am simply updating my home's security protocol before the high tourist season begins. Can you come by tomorrow morning at 9? I can be there at 8:30, Arthur said. I'll bring the commercial-grade deadbolts. After hanging up, I returned to the house. Heather was sitting at the kitchen island, typing rapidly on her tablet. She glanced up, expecting tears or an argument, but I merely picked up my car keys and grabbed my tote bag. I have errands in town, I announced quietly. Did you think about what I said? Heather asked, her voice carrying an edge of impatience. My parents are booking their rental car today. I need to know you'll have your things packed out of the master suite by Thursday. I heard you clearly, Heather, I said. You have made your position entirely transparent. I did not wait for her reply. I drove into the village, stopping first at the local branch of my bank. I opened a separate account, transferred my personal funds out of the shared household expenses pool, and revoked the secondary debit card I had previously issued to Julian for grocery runs. That afternoon, I met with my longtime financial advisor at her office near the harbor. We reviewed the property deed, confirming that the title was solely in my name, free of any encumbrances or secondary claims. Julian had never contributed to the mortgage, nor had he ever signed a lease agreement. Legally, he and Heather were guests residing at my sole discretion. If you wish to terminate their occupancy, Helen, you must provide written notification. My advisor explained, reviewing the state guidelines. However, as sole property owner, you maintain absolute control over security modifications and access privileges to the structure. I understand, I said. I am not looking for a prolonged legal feud. I am simply establishing clear physical parameters. When I returned home later that evening, the house was quiet. Julian was sitting on the back patio drinking a beer while watching the sun dip below the pine trees. I walked out and sat in the cedar chair across from him. Your wife informed me of her plans for her parents? I began directly. Julian looked down at his bottle, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Look, Mom Heather's parents can be very demanding. She just wants them to be comfortable while they're visiting. It's only for a few weeks. The RV park isn't that bad. Julian, I said, stopping him before he could continue his rehearsed speech. This is my home. It was bought with your father's life insurance and my 30 years of labor. I will not be displaced from my own bed for anyone. She's my wife, Helen, he said, his voice tightening with frustration. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We just need some space. You are welcome to find that space elsewhere, I replied softly, because it will not be created by removing me from my house. He stared at me clearly, assuming my refusal was merely an emotional stance that would soften by morning. By Tuesday morning, the atmosphere in the house was stifling. Heather operated with an icy efficiency, pointedly placing moving boxes in the hallway near my bedroom door as a passive-aggressive reminder of her expectation. She spoke on the phone in elevated tones, discussing interior arrangements with her mother and detailing how they would convert my reading nook into a sitting area. I ignored the boxes entirely. Instead, I spent the morning systematically gathering my most valuable personal items, my grandmother's silver important family documents, and my private journals, and moving them into a secured cedar chest in my locked office upstairs. I worked with methodical precision, showing no anger or distress. When Arthur arrived at 8:30 on Wednesday morning, his service truck pulled into the driveway right behind Heather's SUV. She came out to the porch, her forehead creased with annoyance as Arthur began unloading his toolboxes. What is this? She demanded, looking from Arthur to me. Why is there a service van blocking the driveway? Arthur is here to upgrade the exterior locks, I said, holding my clipboard with the signed work order. Heather laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. We don't need new locks. The current ones work fine. Besides, my parents need a physical key that's easy to turn. Electronic keypads are ridiculous. This is not a collaborative decision, Heather, I said, keeping my posture straight and my voice entirely devoid of hostility. The hardware on this house is my responsibility. Arthur, please start with the front door entry. Heather turned to Julian, who had just stepped out onto the porch holding his morning coffee. Julian, tell your mother this is absurd. She's wasting money on security hardware when we should be preparing the guest rooms. Julian looked at the tools spread across the porch, then at my face. For the first time, he saw no hesitation in my eyes. Heather, just let her do it, he muttered, backing away from the confrontation. It's her house. By Wednesday afternoon, all exterior entryways had been upgraded with heavy-duty keypad deadbolts. Arthur handed me a single physical master key and instructed me on how to set the digital access codes. I set a master code known only to myself and programmed a temporary restricted code for Julian that would only remain active until the end of the week. That evening, I invited Julian into my study while Heather was out running errands. I laid 2 documents on the mahogany desk between us. One was a copy of the property deed showing my sole ownership. The other was a formal 30-day notice to vacate drafted by my legal counsel. "What is this, Mom?" Julian asked, his voice shaking slightly as he scanned the paperwork. "It is a clear boundary," I replied. "I welcomed you and Heather into my home out of love to help you build your future. But your wife has treated my generosity as her entitlement, and you have allowed her to do so. Telling me to vacate my own home for her parents was the final line." "She didn't mean it like that," Julian stammered, attempting his usual defense. "She was just overwhelmed. She meant every word," I said calmly. "And so do I. Her parents will not be staying in this house. Furthermore, you and Heather need to secure alternative housing arrangements. The temporary access code I provided for your smartphone app will expire on Friday at noon." Julian stared at me as if seeing his quiet, retired mother for the very first time. "You're serious? You're actually kicking us out?" "I am reclaiming my home," I corrected him gently. "You are an adult man with a good job, Julian. It is time you take responsibility for your family's living arrangements rather than sacrificing my dignity to keep peace in your marriage." He took this paper, his jaw set in silence, and walked out of the room. Thursday passed in tense silence. Heather refused to speak to me, moving through the halls with dramatic huffs and slamming cabinet doors. She clearly believed my 30-day notice was a bluff, an idle threat designed to force an apology. She continued her preparations for her parents' arrival, even going so far as to order a large shipment of gourmet groceries delivered directly to the front porch. On Friday morning, the day her parents were scheduled to arrive, Heather packed 2 large suitcases into the back of her SUV. I watched from the kitchen window as she spoke angrily on her cell phone in the driveway, gesturing wildly toward the house. Julian came downstairs carrying his briefcase. He looked exhausted, the strain of the past few days visible in the deep shadows beneath his eyes. He stopped near the kitchen island where I was making breakfast. "Their flight lands at 2, Julian said quietly. "Heather thinks you'll break down once her parents actually walk up to the door. She thinks you won't cause a scene in front of guests." "Heather misunderstands my character," I replied, placing a plate of toast on the counter. "I have no intention of creating a scene. The boundary has already been set. How she handles the reality of that boundary in front of her family is entirely up to her." "I told her we should get a hotel room for them," Julian admitted, looking at the floor. "She wouldn't listen. She insisted this was about establishing authority." "Authority requires ownership, Julian," I said softly. "Heather owns nothing here." Julian stood there for a long moment, nodding slowly as the weight of my words finally registered. Without another word, he picked up his bag and left for his office. At 11 o'clock, Heather drove off to the airport, leaving her remaining boxes strewn across the living room rug. The moment Heather's car pulled out of the gravel driveway, I moved with calm efficiency. I grabbed the master security pad from my desk and opened the access portal on my phone. With 3 precise keystrokes, I permanently revoked the temporary access code I had assigned to Julian. Next, I walked through the ground floor, gathering Heather's loose boxes, her personal items, her dry cleaning, and the gourmet groceries she had delivered that morning. I carried them out to the covered side porch near the garage, neatly stacking them on elevated wooden pallets to protect them from the coastal dampness. I locked the side door behind me, checking the deadbolt to ensure the mechanism had fully engaged. I then went through every room on the main level, resetting the thermostats to my preferred temperatures, pulling open the curtains to let in the bright afternoon sunlight, and placing my favorite stack of books back on the living room coffee table. At precisely 1:45, I sat down in my armchair by the front bay window with a fresh cup of Earl Grey tea and a hardcover novel. The house was quiet, filled only with the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant murmur of the tide against the rocks below. I was not nervous. I felt no surge of adrenaline, nor any temptation to second-guess my actions. Decades of working in public schools had taught me that clear, calm, and immediate consequences were the only effective response to deliberate boundary violations. Outside, the clock ticked past 2 o'clock. The gravel in the driveway crunched as 2 vehicles pulled up to the front gate. Heather had arrived, bringing her parents along to witness what she assumed would be her quiet victory over an elderly mother-in-law. I took a slow sip of my tea and remained seated. Through the bay window, I watched as Heather stepped out of her SUV, followed by her parents and Julian, who had evidently met them at the airport. Heather walked up the front steps with an air of complete triumph, keying her usual code into the new electronic lock on the front door. A sharp red light flashed on the keypad. A low warning beep echoed across the porch. Heather tried the code again, hitting the numbers with increasing force. Again, the lock flashed red and remained firmly engaged. She rattled the heavy brass door handle violently, but the deadbolt did not budge an inch. "Julian," she snapped, turning to my son. "Your code isn't working. Use yours." Julian stepped forward, pulled out his phone, and looked at the app screen. "It's disabled, Heather. I told you she was serious." Heather's face flushed with fury. She turned and began pounding her fist against the solid oak door. "Helen, open this door right now. My parents are standing out here in the cold. This is completely unacceptable." I stood up, walked calmly to the front foyer, and pulled back the small brass viewing hatch built into the heavy door. I looked out at the 4 people standing on my porch. Heather's parents looked bewildered and embarrassed, clutching their carry-on bags while Heather's face was contorted with anger. "Helen, let us in," Heather demanded, her voice rising to a screech. "You need to leave right now. I told you my parents were staying here." I looked directly into Heather's eyes through the glass. My voice was low, clear, and carried easily through the speaker grill. "You spoke those words, Heather," I said with absolute composure. "But this house is mine. My name is on the deed. My labor paid for every brick, and I decide who enters. Your belongings are neatly packed on the side porch. You, your husband, and your guests need to leave my property immediately." Heather's father, a pragmatic man who finally understood the situation, pulled his daughter back by the arm. "Heather, stop it," he said sharply, his voice laced with profound embarrassment. "Is this her house?" Heather opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. She looked at Julian, expecting him to step in, but my son simply shook his head, picked up 2 of Heather's suitcases from the side porch, and walked toward his car. "We're going to a hotel, Heather," Julian said, his voice firmer than I had heard it in years. Pack the rest of your things into the trunk." Crying out of sheer frustration and ruined pride, Heather had no choice but to follow. Within 20 minutes, the driveway was empty. The taillights of their cars disappeared down the winding coastal road, leaving only the quiet whisper of the wind through the pines. 2 weeks later, Julian came by the house alone during his lunch hour. He did not ask to come inside, remaining on the front porch with a quiet, respectful posture. He informed me that they had signed a short-term lease on an apartment in town, and that he was attending marriage counseling with Heather as a condition of staying together. "I'm sorry, Mom," Julian said softly, looking at the newly installed lock keypad. "I should have stopped her the moment she spoke to you like that." I let things get out of hand because I was afraid of the conflict. Recognizing that is a start, Julian, I replied, standing in the doorway. You are always my son, and I love you. But my home will always be a place of respect. He nodded, hugged me briefly, and walked back to his car. I watched him leave, then turned back into my quiet, sunlit home. The coastal breeze carried the scent of salt air through the open windows, and for the first time in months, the air felt completely clean.